Welcome to ICA Miami's virtual lecture. This is part of our seminar series on animation and the future of the image. And we've had a couple of great seminar series with a great cohort. Last year we had Professor Esther Leslie, and this week we've had Professor Tom Gunning, who's led a series of really rich seminars on everything from animation and photo to film and just the range of ways that animation is critical to image making. Um, Please also join us next Wednesday at noon Eastern Time for our third and last public lecture with contemporary artist Tala Madani. So today we have Professor Tom Gunning, who will give us a lecture, and I will just introduce him and pass over the mic, and we'll leave time at the end of this lecture for questions, so please hold on to those, and we're excited to hear them. So Professor Tom Gunning works on problems of film style and interpretation, film history, and film culture. His published work is nearly 200 publications and has concentrated on early cinema from its origins to World War I, as well as on the culture of modernity from which cinema arose, relating it to still photography, stage melodrama, magic lantern shows, as well as wider cultural concerns such as the tracking of criminals, the World Expositions, and spiritualism. His concept of the cinema of attractions has tried to relate the development of cinema to other forces of storytelling, such as new experiences of space and time in modernity and an emerging modern visual culture. His book, D.W. Griffith and the Origins of American Narrative Film, traces the way film style interacted with new economic structures in the early American film industry and with new tasks of storytelling. His book on Fritz Lang deals with systemic nature of the director's oeuvre and the processes of interpretation. He recently published an anthology of essays published by the University of Chicago Press entitled The Attractions of the Moving Image. He has written on avant-garde film, both in its European pre-World War I manifestations and the American avant-garde film up to the present day. He has also written on genre in Hollywood cinema and on the relationship between cinema and technology, the issues of film culture, the historical factors of exhibition and criticism, and spectators' experience throughout film history are recurrent themes in his work. So we have a very accomplished speaker with us today, and we're really grateful to have had you lead these seminars, and also really grateful to the students who made it an incredible experience. So I'll just pass the mic over to you, and we're excited for the talk.
Well, thank you very much, Donna. And as she mentioned, the seminar, which we've had this 3 sessions of it this week, was very satisfying for me, particularly the interaction with the participants. And I will, in this lecture, both try to distill some of the ideas that came out of that seminar, as well as, because I think some of them will be here for this lecture, give some new kind of ideas as well, and approaches. So we'll get a little bit of a mixture of the familiar and the new, and that's in a way what I'm talking about. Animation. So much is packed into the word. Most immediately, it refers to a technology within the realm of what we call moving pictures, which is the ability to make images move. Now, animation as a special sort of moving image doesn't capture motion as photographic or live action film or video does. But rather it creates that motion. It makes things, objects, drawings, shapes, can be abstract, seem to move of their own accord, when in fact we know that some invisible hand or some hidden technology lurks behind it all, giving them a shove or a nudge, and thereby creating an illusion of life. The word animation contains more, though, I think. a hint of a kind of hidden magic, the source of this impulse to make things move. Anima, which is a Latin word, anima means life, but more deeply and perhaps more archaically, soul or spirit, the force within live things that makes them live and move and have their being. In its most literal meaning, then, animation means endowing something which is initially inert, lifeless, not just with movement and therefore the appearance of life, but at least in a sense, to inject a kind of soul into things. So, at the root of the technology of making images move, of bringing drawings to life, is something that we perhaps can call magic. Now, magic is perhaps the first human technology. It's a way of controlling the world and its things to, in effect, endow them with anima, or as anthropology often uses the term mana, a term that comes from Polynesian thought, this kind of power of things that can be controlled by magic. So it's a way of controlling the world, just like all technology and its things, and especially in this sense, to endow them with anima and to determine their effects. So, okay, that opens up the word. But there's another aspect to deal with, and that's the idea of image. Now, as a film and media scholar, I constantly confront a central question. What is the nature of what we call an image? And has it changed fundamentally as our media technology has transformed? In the modern era, especially since the invention of photography around the middle of the 19th century, the nature of the image has become increasingly complex. Although making images has always entailed technique, that is, tools and materials and practices, paint and brushes and canvas, things like that. But with modern technology, the technology not only enters into the way that the image can be reproduced, this idea that Walter Benjamin talked about, the image in the art, the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproduction. But not only is technology now about reproduction, but it is basically about a means of production. So the modern technological image creates new relations to the viewers and to the referent, that is to say, the thing which it portrays, the referent of the image. Now, could these transformations ironically renew? And I think my answer is at least perhaps these new technologies renew some of the most ancient beliefs about images, that they're rooted in magic, and that they're no longer simply reproducing things, but they're exerting influences on those who behold them and use them. Now, Jean-Luc Godard, recently deceased, great French film director, in one of his most amazing films, Alphaville, actually begins, and those of you who've seen it undoubtedly remember this. You hear this kind of gravelly voice. It actually was someone whose vocal cords had been removed and had to speak technologically. This strange voice would be heard on the soundtrack, and it would say, and I think I'm slightly paraphrasing here, I couldn't get the exact quote, but he says, and I'll try to imitate the voice, sometimes reality becomes too complex. Myth must give it form. And so in telling this science fiction story about a future world controlled by computers, he actually draws on the kind of film mythology of the detective, Lemmy Caution, who who invades and destroys his computer controlled world. But what I want to draw from this is this idea that myth is not only a kind of archaic and surpassed form of belief, but it's a way that we can understand the complexities of reality. It gives us a story. And starting from that premise, I've based this seminar and to some extent this lecture on a myth that I think is really fundamental, and that is the myth of the sculptor Pygmalion and his creation Galatea. So the myth of Pygmalion was described as a Cyprian, from Cyprus, sculptor, and his creation Galatea probably emerged in deep antiquity. But the Roman poet Ovid, who was writing just as turns from BC to AD, um, gave the myth, I think, its most enduring and compelling form, the one that has really survived, and it's beautifully written, uh, and is part of his great epic poem, The Metamorphoses, which is about a number of ways that the gods have intervened, or magic has intervened and transformed people, as is in the story. So I'm going to read a few passages from the Ovid. And this is an image. This is actually from the French painter Jean-Léon Gérôme around the end of the 19th century. And we see the basic myth here of the uh, sculptor embracing his creation and it coming to life. So here is first section from the poem. With wonderful skill, he carved a figure brilliantly out of snow-white ivory, no mortal woman, and fell in love with his own creation. The features are those of a real girl, who you might think lived and wished to move if modesty did not forbid it. Indeed, I love this phrase, art hides his art. Of course, is a kind of ambition of a certain type of art, of realism, art whose ability lies in its ability to conceal its methods. Anyway, getting back to the Ovid. Indeed, art hides his art. He marvels, and passion for his bodily image consumes his heart. Very important, this idea that he becomes passionately uh, consumed by looking at this image. Often he runs his hands over the work, tempted as to whether it is flesh or ivory, not admitting it to be ivory. He kisses it and thinks his kisses are returned, and speaks to it, and holds it, and imagines that his fingers press into the limbs, and is afraid lest bruises appear from the pressure. So there's the creation, there's the passion that it inspires, and then there is this kind of almost perverse, or maybe more than almost, um, interaction with the work. He touches it, but of course he looks for flesh. He feels ivory. It's hard. So this describes the first phase of the tale, the creation of an image of great beauty, the desire it inspires, and the touch that Pygmalion tentatively applies to its creation. Now, we usually think of images as visual, and indeed, this is probably the most frequent definition. Even sculpture is mainly visual. But let's follow Ovid and consider the role of touch in this mythical scene. Touch is not necessarily a sense that we normally apply to an image, even to sculpture. In fact, art historian Victor Stoichita, whose book, which you see here, The Pygmalion Effect, from Ovid to Hitchcock, is kind of the inspiration for my seminar and the course, and it's something I strongly advise. It's very readable, even though it's very precise and scholarly. So Stoichita, I never get his name quite right, begins his fascinating treatment of the Pygmalion myth in art with an admonition that we find often posted and almost always at least tacitly understood in modern museums and art collections, do not touch. And as Stoichita comments, the stricture declares the work of art status as an image rather than a thing. The difference between an image and a thing. And to quote him, which I think is a profound insight, images we know are different from the rest of the world. And then he says in italics, they do not exist. Now, this sounds like a paradox, as though Stoichita, a art historian, is abolishing his own, career here. They don't exist. But of course, what he means is something else. Um, and the idea of touch or do not touch is here, I think, quite important. Um, Even though obviously paintings and sculptures exist, but the fact that we don't touch them put them in a different kind of ontological realm. And indeed, touch is the way that we verify the reality of things around us. So that I'm quoting a scientist here, a doctor. He says there's a widespread belief that touch is the sense that is the best measure of reality. Now, the painting here is actually of my namesake, St. Thomas, who, when Jesus Christ appears resurrected to him, at first he doesn't believe it, even though he sees it, and he demands that he should be able to touch and to put his finger, and you see this, amazing materialistic image in a religious artwork, putting his finger into the wound. And this is, very much the emblem of the idea of touch being the verification of reality. But images are not meant to be touched. But the story of Pygmalion and Galatea is about this kind of realm in between. So within Ovid's text, Pygmalion's touch is less a sign of his skepticism, not believing it, than his desire. And crucially, at this point in the story, that desire is unfulfilled. He doesn't get a response when he touches the ivory girl. Um, so, but nonetheless, that impulse, eros in Latin, in Ovid's language, is dominant. And thinking about the image in relation to the erotic, to desire, is one of the basic things that Stoichita reminds us of. So here, the magic or the power of the divine um, enters into Ovid's story because it shapes things and changes things. Um, because the magic, or rather the supernatural, the power of the goddess Venus must be invoked and take over. And Pygmalion, in fact, looking at this desire, looking at this object he loves but can't respond to him, he beseeches the goddess of love, Venus, to grant a petition. He goes during her festival to a place where sacrifices are being made. And as Ovid says, Pygmalion, having made his offering at the sacrifice, stood by the altar and said shyly, if you can grant all things, you gods, I wish a bride to have. And Ovid adds, not daring to say, the girl of ivory, he says, one like my ivory girl. I think that hesitation is really important. He wants to say, I want this ivory girl, but he knows it's kind of crazy. So he says, I want one like it. So that realm of imagery comes in. Now, the goddess, who, of course, she's the goddess of love, she traffics in desire, and she actually fulfills his his wish. And to picking up Ovid here, he comes back to his atelier. When he returned, he sought out the image of his girl and, leaning over the couch, kissed her. She felt warm. He pressed his lips to her again and also touched her breast with his hand. The ivory yielded to his touch and lost its hardness, altering under his fingers as the beeswax of Hermetia softens in the sun and is molded under the thumb into many forms made usable by use. Now, the reference there is a mountain in Greece where there were many bees and where the honey was particularly valued. The honey, of course, comes from the honeycomb, which is made of wax. And because the mountain is so high, it was believed that the sun could easily melt the wax there. So he's having this experience of like melting wax. Ivory is turning into flesh, but it's having this intermediary of the wax. To pick up the story here again, the lover is stupefied and joyful, but uncertain and afraid he's wrong, reaffirms the fulfillment of his wishes with his hand again and again. It was flesh. The pulse throbbed under his thumb. So not only flesh, but blood there, the movement of blood. Then the hero of Apophis was indeed overfull of words with which to thank Venus, and still pressed his mouth against a mouth that was merely a likeness. But I'm sorry, I misread that. Against a mouth that was not merely a likeness. In other words, we've moved from image to flesh, from image that doesn't exist to something that exists as a thing, as part of the world. The girl felt his kisses, blushed, and raising her bashful eyes to the light, saw both her lover and the sky. So she not only opens to his response, but to the world, to the heavens above. So the extraordinary art historian, Victor Stoichita, in this work that I've mentioned, the Pygmalion Effect, and subtitle From Ovid to Hitchcock, traces the transformations that this tale has undergone from antiquity through the Middle Ages and Renaissance to the early modern era, and then again to what I could call the era of our modern new technology to photography and cinema. From Ovid's telling, Stoichita highlights two things in particular that open key perspectives on the nature of the image and how it affects us. First, this erotic charge. He's not just contemplating, he's not just involved in aesthetic, appreciation of beauty. He wants her. He is sexually aroused. He is in the realm of eros. So, this power of attraction doesn't underlie all images, but it does define the power that certain images have. It transforms how Pygmalion treats the figure that he's fashioned. No longer merely a sculptor or a spectator, he enters into a different relation driven by desire. He caresses, he kisses, he holds, and he speaks to his image. Perhaps most important, even before it's alive, he imagines it as if it were alive. So Stoichita especially stresses that action of touching and the role of testing, which the material of his love is made of. And he talks about wax and flesh. Desire makes us move from the visual into the tactile, into the touch. But more importantly, a touch that wants a response. It's not just touching the sculpture. It's wanting the sculpture to respond. It is a desire for an image that is alive. So the desire to bring an image to life, which is the theme of this lecture and the seminar that came before it. And I might add, here, of course, we have an image, another painting by Jerome of kind of reverse angle of the kisses and the transformation. And of course, you can see that already her hair is red, even though her feet are still very fixed in marble. And I might add here that I think it's somewhat ironic and perhaps appropriate that I'm coming to you through Zoom, which we're seeing illustrations of here, and which has become a whole mode, not only of communication, but of imagery in this world. And the paradox of it, we're taking it for granted because this is the easiest way. I don't have to travel to Miami. You don't have to, leave your home even to see me. But what is the nature of this image? Uh, am I coming to you as or am I coming to you live? I think we could say that, but what would we mean by that? Uh, because this image, if it doesn't exist, as Stoichita says, what I think he means is, or at least one way to understand that, is to say it isn't tangible, it can't be touched, and it's not inhabiting the same space that you do. That this is a very basic aspect of what this means. So even though, am I with you or am I not? You can see and hear me, and I can move about a bit, at least within a frame. Um, but you can't apply Pygmalion's essential test to my image. We can't touch. But if the image entails absence, we might also say that it's created to overcome that absence. This technology is because I can't be there in the flesh in Miami, but I can talk to you, and it's not just the same as reading an essay. I am, in some sense, in some type of contact as an image. And here we could invoke another classical myth, which has often been given as the origin of imagery. And this is the story of the Corinthian maid. And this is a painting by the English painter Joseph Wright in the 19th century or beginning of the 19th century. And the story, the myth that underlies this is that Corinthian maid, who we see there, her lover is leaving on a voyage. She's going to miss him, and he falls asleep, and his shadow is cast on the wall by the lamp. And she takes up a kind of pencil and traces that shadow onto the wall so that even when he leaves, even when he's absent, she will have his image with her. Now, this means for a moment here, me getting into the kind of technicality of terminology, because something that Stoichita indicates, I think, very, very powerfully, is he is indicating there are different types of images. And I think we could contrast, even though this is not his main mode of bringing out this difference, this Corinthian maid with Pygmalion Galatea. Um, and for Stoichita, he uses the term for this type, this Corinthian maid's type of image, mimesis, Greek term for representation, coming from the word mime. So capturing a likeness. But Stoichita makes a point that this is different from what we have with Pygmalion, that here we have a very close relationship to the model that leads to the image. Rather than the image becoming real, the model, the lover is real, and the image doesn't exist. It isn't real. And all she will have will be an image, whereas Pygmalion will actually have a living woman and they'll have a baby and so on. So to pick up the point here, in the contrast, he draws Stoichita between mimesis and what he calls the simulacrum. And as he puts it, in the story of Pygmalion, the statue is not imitating anything or anybody. Pygmalion's statue is the fruit of his imagination, and his art. So we could say that the impulse behind Pygmalion's artifact, his artifact, is less representation than desire. Not that the two can't be combined as they are in the story of the Corinthian maid, but rather than a way to keep a memory alive through a sort of pseudo-presence, as is captured in the shadow. The simulacrum instead is the product of fantasy, of imagination. It starts there. That's where it comes from. And as such, it carries, as Stoichita puts it, and this is, I think, one of his best insights, it's on the first page of his book, it carries a dark threat. And that threat is reality itself is replaced by the simulacrum of reality. So instead of just, preserving something that's real, we create something that alters reality, that adds to reality. Now, Stoichita is very aware that in our contemporary era, there is a concern, ever growing, that modern technology in some form will be replacing reality with simulacrum. And he was writing just before the expansion of AI. And he uses, though, I think, the myth of Pygmalion to explore something that is exploding even further since he's written, the seduction and the possible danger, but also the delight, the pleasure, the desire of the simulacrum. Rather than submission to the real, Pygmalion's creation asserts a power over it. In this sense, the simulacrum really does seem to be like magic. It's born out of erotic desire, and then it's achieved by, and this is important, artifact, by technological skill. But we might stress just as much as Pygmalion's creation may not depend on, or the way that it does depend on the imagination rather than the real, it's not simply an ideal fantasy. Pygmalion and Galatea hardly enact a story of Platonic love. Material, that which can trust, can be touched and transformed, plays an important role in the story. This is really basic. The material Pygmalion used to create his artifact is ivory, chosen for its organic connection with the body. And let's keep in mind, sorry, here, I kind of missed this thing, but just to emphasize this contrast between mimesis and simulacrum. And what he invokes, of course, from ivory to flesh is wax. And wax, particularly because of its ability to mold itself, to melt, to transform, becomes this kind of medium. So it's kind of like something in between the thing and the image. And in the seminar, particularly, we talked about this idea that it's a kind of medium, and makes us aware of how important the idea of a medium, of media is in modern imagery. And in fact, wax not only can melt, it can burn. And I don't know if you've seen this, originally in 3D, which is quite interesting, 1953 movie with Vincent Price, The House of Wax, which is about one of the ways that this similarity between wax and flesh was worked with particularly in the 19th century, was to create images of people, and the wax looked like a flesh, made them look super real, much more than bronze or marble. And in fact, the Wax Museum was never considered a work of art, partly because of it. In the film, there's a point where this house of wax actually is set on fire, and it's a very kind of amazing spectacle. And we should keep in mind, in magic, strong tradition of making figures out of wax in order to control their representative, and particularly, melting them in fire as a way to kill them. And not forget that ivory is a bone. And therefore, not only does it have, for Pygmalion story, the appearance of flesh, at least to some extent, but not the texture, not the hard. It has a hardness, not a yieldingness of flesh. But it also is, as a bone, reminds us in some way of the feeling of death, um, and that kind of death-like quality lurks behind uh, the simulacrum. It is both the appearance of life and the reminder of a kind of death. Um, so this is a very basic thing, that there is this area that we're exploring in imagery that is between life and death, between image and reality, between the imagination and the material, um, and that we are dealing with this idea of transformation in a very basic way. Now, from the very beginning of art, like the cave paintings of, you know, before language, before written language, before, culture, before history, images have been made, representations, but they've almost always been on a material, on a surface. The cave walls would be the first one. Um, this will change. And this involves, for discussion that I want to kind of enter into now, an issue of time and what time means. Because basic for the animated image is not only this idea of bringing something to life, but of bringing it into time. And if we go back to the idea of death, we have this kind of feeling that, okay, great magic, great fulfillment of desire. Pygmalion has brought Galatea to life, but it also means, whereas the ivory statue was in a way immortal, or at least long lasting, she now will have a limited life. As Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, said, as soon as a man is born, or a woman, they're ready to die. So temporality, bringing an image which was supposed to be partly outside of time, that part of its power in being something that doesn't exist. We have the idea of an image that is temporal, it moves, it has duration, but is also introduced into this world of transformation. So let's think about time a bit here. And I always love this statement by St. Augustine in his Confessions, where he has in Book 9 a discussion of time. And he starts it out with this great, great quote. What is time then? If no one asks me, I know. But if I were desirous to explain it to one that should ask me, plainly I don't know. And I think we all, even though we're centuries away from Augustine, um, have this feeling. We know what time is. We live in it. We experience it every day. We regulate our life by it. But what is it? If I don't think about it, I know. But if someone asks me, I realize I don't know. So how do we define time? Um, we might first think of it as a simple dichotomy. On the one hand, there's the idea of the eternal, the ideal, something outside of time, where very often art seems to at least aspire to that realm of the timeless, as opposed to the transitory nature of life. But life, in contrast, is always changing, it's flowing, it passes. Um, and there's a really interesting kind of way of thinking about time and about animation, to my mind, and about movement that is again coming from the classics and from the Greek philosopher Zeno, who had a series of kind of logical paradoxes. And one of them, the one that I think is most enduring, is the idea that if Achilles were racing a turtle, Achilles, the great athlete, runner, powerful, strong man, turtle, the slowest animal, he would never be able to. If the turtle had a start, even very briefly, Achilles could never catch up with him. Now, it's a paradox because we know it's not true, but it was based on the idea that every time that Achilles moves, during that time, the turtle will move too. And so this will be endless, that there's always an addition which Achilles can't overcome. Now, it's crazy, of course. It's an illustration of how to think about the mind. Wikipedia summarizes this as a swift runner like Achilles cannot overtake a slowly moving turtle with a head start because the distance between them will be infinitely subdivided, implying Achilles would require an infinite number of steps to catch up to the tortoise. Now, this is where the error is in the paradox. Yeah, you can always divide up space infinitely, but in running, in movement, in time, he would leap over those tiny increments. Time doesn't divide up. I mean, we can divide time up, but the experience of time, and particularly of motion, is not the same as the mathematical logic of the division of space. Time is not like space to be conceived of as a series of discrete, static uh, instants, but rather is a kind of continual flow. It's a duration in which we're immersed and not an experience like Zeno's detached theorization based in math, not in life. But it raises a question that I think is really interesting in terms of our ideas about the image and its representation. What is the instant? What is the smallest element of time? Is it, as Zeno argued, and as the philosopher Henri Bergson, who basically was one of the great philosophers to dispel Zeno's paradox, he said, time is a flow. It's not these discrete moments. So that the instant is not like the atom of time. It's not like the element out of which it's assembled. It's purely a mental construct. Aristotle, still influenced by this, kind of spatialization, as Bergson put it at the time, saw time as the number of motion, the number that could be applied. But numbers are in a series rather than a flow. And in terms of our larger issue, um, the issue of the instant, it's not like life, it's like the stillness of death. And Bergson defines time in this flow, in that kind of what he called lived time, rather than a series of discrete instants. So human time, lived time, has to be opposed to the simple tick tock, tick tock, tick tock of the clock. Human time stretches along, it contracts, and it lengthens according to our desire. We all know the feeling of that was a short time, that was a long time, not determined by the clock, determined often by our desire. And yet, understanding time eludes us, and time races before us. It may be partly experienced in terms of our desire, but we can't always shape it. Um, so, our desire can make time seem to run or seem to be unbearable. It doesn't, time doesn't obey our desire, even if we feel our desires are shaping our experience of time. Indeed, we often want to stop time, either to eliminate it or to extend it. And here perhaps desire, the simulacrum and magic enter into, if not our real lives, but our art and our desire to control the world through technology. So can time stop? Well, we have one modern technology in art which seems to freeze time, and that is photography. Now, I won't go here, as I did in the seminar, into the consideration, the history of the invention of photography. But I do want to show how it raises certain issues. And we talked about this image in the seminar. Sorry, my chair keeps on gliding out from under me. So I'm giving you a little movement along with my words. So this is a photograph from 1838, when the first photographs taken of a city street by Daguerre, one of the inventors of photography, of the Parisian street, the Boulevard du Temple. And as we talked about this in the seminar, you know, we really have all the quality of a photograph here. The accuracy, the detail. We really see these buildings and the trees and the outlay of the street. But interesting, it's a very busy street in Paris. It was then, and there are no vehicles moving down it. There are no pedestrians walking along it. Why? And the answer has to do with the technology and the nature of photography. When photography was first introduced, the amount of time that it took to make the image on the sensitive plate was long. Initially, it could take hours to get an image. And by the time, a few years after the invention of photography, or almost a decade, that this photograph was taken, it took several minutes. So therefore, anything that was moving, which would have appeared through the lens only for a few seconds, was invisible. It couldn't be registered. So initially, photography was not at all temporal. It couldn't show us time. It could only show us a kind of distillation and, in effect, freeze time. But during the 19th century, photographers worked continually to perfect chemicals, to perfect the shutter, to perfect the camera and the different ways that all the physics of reproduction entered into it, to reduce this exposure time until they could show things that were moving, the people walking along that street, or even, as in this photograph by the great photographer Jean-Henri Lartigue, who worked at the beginning of the 20th century, to freeze a moment, to actually create that unexperienced element of time that Bergson was kind of saying doesn't quite exist, the instant. And the instant looks amazing. Now, this photograph is a really good illustration because we get a sense of motion here in this collapse of this kind of weird bicycle that Lartique's cousin was spinning down the street or down the path and then fell off. We really sense, her tumble and her leg, and we know that that leg is going to fall back down. We know that this is an instant, and we also know this is something that we cannot see. We couldn't see if we were there. We'd see the motion of her falling, but not this instant of her leg up. Photography could show us. And this is an amazing moment. I feel it's revolutionary, where photography, which is invented in order to capture what we see with great accuracy, now is showing us something we cannot see. So it moves from the idea of a mimesis, in a certain sense. It's still a mimesis. It's representing something there, but it's no longer something we see. It's not a mimesis of our vision. It is purely a machine vision. It is purely a technological vision. And this had scientific application. And the most famous was the development of a type of photography known as chronophotography, or the photographing of time. And here we get from 1876, um, the most famous, probably, first application of chronophotography by the San Francisco photographer Edward Muybridge, who was hired by Leland Stanford, the governor, who was a horse raiser and a racing um, aficionado, because he had a bet with his friends about whether all 4 feet of a galloping horse ever were off the ground. And this was something that we could speculate on by looking, but no eye could see. Muybridge, working with instantaneous photography, and here you can see it's kind of almost just a silhouette. It was still very early phase. It didn't have the clarity of Lartigue, but he could capture it, and furthermore, show something nobody had ever seen. Nobody ever had the idea that a horse's legs ever looked like that. Now, this also implied the idea of a sequence. As you can see, there are 12 images here, which Muybridge took by 12 different cameras arranged along the racetrack. Each one triggered as the horse went by hitting a tripwire. And not only do we get this instant, like in Lartigue, but we get a course of motion, something almost like Bergson's flow. And in fact, Muybridge and other chronophotographers not only analyzed motion through these still images, but they were interested to see what they looked like when they were projected, when they moved. So Muybridge worked with a number of kind of technologies that already existed that could make an image move to create the first kind of movies. And so we're moving here into this new technology, animated images, and not only the animation of drawings, but the animation of photographs. Now, as I said, these devices had, and we talked about this more in detail in the seminar, but during the 19th century, a lot of different devices were worked out, and they were usually called philosophical toys because they thought the main people who would enjoy these would be children, and they could also teach them lessons about the nature of perception. And this is one, the zoetrope. And Muybridge and Etienne Jules Marais, his kind of French colleague, used these devices to animate their photographs. But initially, they were being used to animate drawings. So, as the theorist Lev Manovich has pointed out, animation in the sense of drawings brought to life precedes animated live photography. And he kind of claims, in fact, we could think of all of live photography, live, motion derived from living beings as just a subset of animation and a kind of a child of it. So instead of the kind of denigration that animation has, just being cartoons, and which has been changing over the last decade, we can see, if we look at it historically, how important it was. Okay, now we're coming to the end here, and along with the discussion of Pygmalion and Ovid, as I mentioned, Stoichita's book is subtitled From Ovid to Hitchcock, and he has another, not myth in this case, there are no gods involved, and we're involved with modern technology, the motion picture, and a great master of that medium, Alfred Hitchcock, film that he made in 1958 called Vertigo, which also, interestingly, as I pointed out in the seminar, involved a lot of instances of literal animation, collaborations with animators to make certain images. And it's in the story, to briefly say it, it is really the story in a kind of modern version and a more tragic version of Pygmalion, even though it doesn't involve the actual transformation of a statue. But it does involve a relation in the erotic impulse that particularly men, I think one could make an interesting version of it. It would be very different with a woman protagonist. But here we have a male protagonist played by Jimmy Stewart, who, in following a client's wife, who he's concerned about her suicidal behavior, finds that she is obsessed with this image. And so he encounters her in an art museum where she's looking at this image of someone who she doesn't know it, but in fact is an ancestor. And that she begins to have the feeling she's possessed by this woman, and this ghost-like figure committed suicide, and she's afraid that it's going to impel her to commit suicide. Stewart gets fascinated with this, but also, doesn't believe it, is trying to shake this woman as he falls in love with her and out of this fantasy. But he also, in a way, succumbs, and in fact, she succeeds in killing herself, or so it seems, and he goes crazy. He then, after she dies, and after his recovery in a mental hospital, encounters a woman who looks quite a bit like her. It actually is played by the same actress, Kim Novak. And he begins a process like Pygmalion at the beginning with his ivory statue of transforming her into that ideal, of dressing her, giving her the hair color, giving her the makeup, even training her to walk and behave like his dead love. Um, it ends tragically, and it's revealed to be a deception that was arranged for nefarious reasons, and that the detective has fallen victim to this idea of the simulacrum which replaces reality, the simulacrum which overcomes it, which, as I say, in Pygmalion has a happy ending. In Vertigo has a tragic ending. The woman dies. The man is, well, we don't know exactly what's going to happen to him afterwards, but he's devastated. And for us as viewers, we're taken through a journey in which we have to contemplate our own investment in the images on the screen, the way they're beautiful, the way we desire them, the way their stories intrigue us, and the way that they seem to vacillate between reality and the image, and that very ontological ambiguity is part of their fascination. And the other point that I want to end with is, of course, the evolution of technology. As though, in a way, our technology has been infected. I don't want to just do that negatively, but infected in the sense of transformed by this basic desire, this basic magical desire to be able to bring images to life, to make what we want become real, and that in our stories there are both versions of that which are fulfilled and versions of it which are tragic. And that, as I think Stoichita imagined even before it was happening, or when it was just happening, that our technology, our image culture is confronting us with that type of paradox of where we're going to go, whether we're going to have the image replace reality, the image become a kind of reality, be used, be useful, or whether we're in control or the victims of all of that. So that's where I'm going to end here on this slightly ambiguous, maybe somewhat dark image here of Kim Novak casting her shadow on the wall.
Okay, well, thank you for such a wonderful series of seminars and for this talk, and to all of our participants for, your thoughtful participation.
And thank you, Donna, for arranging it, because I know it wasn't simple. And I know we
Absolutely.
had
No, it
a
was
moment
great.
of frustration of when I realized we couldn't use the whole Stoichita text and things like that. But nonetheless, the
Yeah, it was
trade-offs,
great.
things that
Yeah,
were made available were really essential. So thank you.
of course, of course. And we will stay in touch.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.